Unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard by now that the Home Depot has announced it is buying HD Supply in what is arguably the biggest acquisition news in the industrial distribution space in at least several years. The deal is valued at $8 billion, and including debt, Home Depot is paying about $9.1 billion in total. But besides the nuts and bolts of the deal already shared in press releases, I wanted to take a few minutes to dive into the details surrounding this deal and what it means for both companies and the MRO product space. In its Q3 earnings call with analysts on November 17th, Home Depot said it valued the fragmented MRO market at $55 billion and said that the company's share of that was roughly $2 billion. So if you add HD Supply's $3 billion of revenue to that, the acquisition gives Home Depot between 9 and 10% of the total MRO market by its calculation and would place that number 5 or 6 on our 2020 Big 50 list right next to Fastenal. As for the why behind this acquisition, that's fairly straightforward. When Home Depot first sold off HD Supply back in 2007, it was to refocus Home Depot on DIY consumers. And the retailer was pretty content with that focus until 2015 when it bought Interline Brands, an MRO products distributor that last charted on the Big 50 in 2018 at $2.6 billion in 2017 sales. Home Depot then rebranded Interline and a few other smaller MRO brands as the Home Depot Pro, catering to the company's growing contractor customer base. That customer base provides plenty of momentum as HD Supply comes on board. In Home Depot's Q3 earnings call, CFO Ted Decker said that the company saw double-digit year-over-year growth in both its Pro and DIY customers. And while DIY sales grew faster than Pro sales, its Pro business posted the strongest growth seen all year. Decker said, quote, "As we look at our different Pro cohorts, growth with our smaller Pro customers has been consistent with strong double-digit growth every month of the year. Growth with our larger Pro customers is healthy and accelerated from the second quarter. However, some large Pros still face headwinds related to the current operating environment, including some customers being hesitant to invite Pros into their homes." End quote. So why now? Why did Home Depot wait 5 years after the Interline acquisition to acquire HD Supply? CEO Craig Menear touched on that in the call as well, saying, quote, "First of all, over a period of time, the HD Supply business came down to essentially the MRO maintenance facility business that it is today that we just put the offer in on, so it strategically lines up with what we're trying to get accomplished in the MRO business much more so than it did a few years ago. From a timing standpoint, that's the logic there." End quote. That Menear quote alludes to an important point about this acquisition. Home Depot isn't acquiring the HD Supply that many had come to know over the past 13 years since it was first spun off. Size-wise, HD peaked at $9 billion in revenue in 2014, but the company has been slimming down ever since, selling off less profitable business units of hardware, power solutions, interior business solutions, and waterworks segments over the next few years. And in 2019, the company's total revenue was down to $6.15 billion. That figure was then halved just recently as HD Supply completed the sale of its construction and industrial Whitecap business this past October 20th. So, Home Depot was essentially getting 1/3 of the HD Supply that existed at its 2014 peak, as HD Supply has about $3 billion in annual revenue going forward, with a focus strictly on maintenance solutions. Not that that's small by any means, as it would still place number 10 on ID's 2020 Big 50 list. ID readers may have gotten a bit of whiplash as this acquisition news progressed. On November 9th, a Bloomberg report said that Lowe's was in talks with advisors about acquiring HD Supply, citing people familiar with the matter. But just a few hours later that day, Lowe's put out a statement sternly denying that report, and then the Home Depot news came 1 week later. Still, when it comes to these kinds of acquisition rumors, where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And while we at ID don't want to share speculation, the way that news cycle evolved leaves me with a few thoughts. One is that it's very possible that Lowe's, at least at one point, indeed looked into acquiring HD Supply, and that either it just didn't pan out, or Home Depot was able to swoop in and take it. Another thought is now that Home Depot has HD Supply back in its mix, Lowe's may soon look to throw a counterpunch and make an MRO deal of its own. In Lowe's Q3 earnings call on November 18th, an analyst asked whether the Home Depot news impacts Lowe's competitive strategy in the MRO space, to which CEO Marvin Ellison said it doesn't. He emphasized that Lowe's is committed to its core retail business, while it will continue to target the MRO segment with its current pro strategy with outside sales reps. Nevertheless, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Lowe's soon make a similar acquisition announcement for another major distributor on our Big 50 list before Home Depot can take too much market share there. So the question there would be, which distributor would it be?